So I was wondering if you could explain anatta. What is that? Non-self, not self. There is no self. What is it? And what's the point of that? Why do we need to know that or experience that?
Just wait for the wind. Well, I think you can start by explaining what it isn't. And it isn't, it is not a denial of self, as in there is no self. Because usually people would basically hear the teaching anatta, and then end up kind of naturally jumping into an assumption of, so there is no real self, thus none of this is real. But denying the problem doesn't actually solve it, and especially doesn't work in this case, because the sense of self, it's not about some metaphysical mistake, it's about a gratuitous sense of ownership of your experience, of your senses. And because of that ownership, the sense of self is generated. So the sense of self in people's lives is not a problem, it's a symptom of an underlying problem of ownership. And if you discern that right order and stop regarding things as mine, and by that I mean being emotionally connected to them, because that's the ownership. It's not like you don't care about things that you don't care. So if something happens to those things, you won't be affected. So you saying, that's not mine, makes no difference. You want to apply the attitude of not mine onto the personal, emotional level. As in, you want to apply it onto things that you will be affected by if you lose them, if they change against your will. So anatta is the most fundamental principle of Buddha's teaching, refers exactly to that, because there's nothing that you can actually own, in a sense of that you would be its master, controller, in charge of. And I'm talking about your life, the most fundamental aspects of your experience. So your feelings, your perceptions, your intentions are fundamentally given to you, basically. They arise, and because you don't know any better, you just assume that they're mine because they're here for me. Who else is there? It's just me. But that's the problem with ignorance, because there is no first origin of that mistake. It is a mistake, but there is no first point where that mistake became, before which everything was nice and pure. So that mistake is a starting point, which means you have to accept that there is a mistake. So you have to accept that there is a sense of self that thinks it owns things. But then you listen to the Buddha's teaching, you read the suttas, and you actually get the sense that it's other way around. It's because you own things, you keep redetermining that sense of self as that independent owner of these things. But it's, as I said, it's other way around. It's because you keep engaging in the acts of ownership, that sense of self is being maintained. So you stop doing that, and then the anatta teaching becomes apparent. It's not like there is no self, there is no mistake, but you undo the mistake of ownership, so then you can truly say there is not self, as in not my own self. So that phenomenon of self still remains. Now it's not mine. There is no involvement of denial of the sense of self. It's basically accepting it as an arisen phenomena and then undoing the ownership of it. So you can truly say anatta means that which is taken to be myself, it's not mine. And that experience is the experience of anatta. And another thing is basically, I think we spoke about it before actually. I don't know whether it was recorded or not, but often people would just quote random science or things like that just to prove that everything is constantly changing, thus nothing is mine. But that's not anatta that the Buddha talks about. It's that personal side of ownership, that emotional connection to it. So you're not proving any anatta if you say, look, this stone over there is comprised of such and such minerals and elements and atoms and neutrons and whatever else. Thus it's not really real, it's not really mine. But you don't care about it to begin with. So you're not proving anything. Because that sense of ownership, it's not an ideology. or a kind of an abstract idea. It's emotional attitude. Now try and explaining the same scientific way to your own daughter, or your son, or your child, your baby, or something you're inherently bound with emotionally. And then see how indifferent you can remain. In fact, of your explanation that it's nothing, it's just a clump of elements and cells. It's pointless. It's completely it doesn't even apply on the same domain, such explanation. Which means people use it only for this ideological purpose to justify their views. But practically, basically the Buddha's teaching frees you from that emotional dependence. Doesn't explain things to you. So if you think that anatta is this random, everything is constantly changing and nothing is mine, well, it isn't, because that doesn't free you from that emotional dependence upon those things. So you want to basically find things that you are emotionally dependent upon and then start undoing the ownership of them, because you see yourself liable to suffering on account of losing them, even if you don't necessarily lose them. And actually you don't want to wait for them to be gone to see that you're liable to suffering of them being gone. You want to do it before. So that's what I mean. Anatta refers to that personal attitude of something that's dear to you, something that you are connected with. And I think the etymology of that word, of the Sanskrit nitya, as in Nietzsche.
Yes,
Sorry?
anicca.
Well, anicca and Nietzsche, as in anitya and nitya in Sanskrit. It's been a long time ago since I was looking for that, but there are lots of synonyms with that word, and it can be used basically for a personal, internal, dear to me, nitya. And then basically anitya would be the opposite of that. So yes, you can say it's impermanent, but actually it probably doesn't do it justice because of, well, today's modern contemporary views. What people think permanence, impermanence is this kind of almost impersonal debate of physics, of how everything is impermanent, everything is constantly changing. But that's just denial of the existence of the things that you're emotionally bound with. And that denial can provide people with a relief, with a degree of relief, which is why they mistake it for some sort of truth. Because you're denying the problem, it covers the problem up. But it doesn't solve it, doesn't uproot it. Which means sooner or later, you'll forget about denying it, or something else will point at it, remind you of it, and you're back to square one. You made no difference. So that's why you really want to first accept the problem and stop denying it, and stop finding justification for it. And that can be helped if you think that Nietzsche and anicca actually refers to personal and dear, and then not taken personally and not dear to me, as in you're indifferent. Emotional equilibrium. And there's that simile that the Buddha gives to the monks. He said, people get basically upset, affected by suffering, when things that they're attached to are gone, are affected. So they should basically abandon the attachment. He doesn't say they should basically find the justification for the denial of the existence of those things. And then the simile that he gives is basically when he says they were sitting in the grove, in the forest, and he said, so for example, see all these sticks and branches just lying around here that you're completely indifferent to. Would you be upset if some people come here and start breaking these branches and taking them and burning them? They say, we wouldn't. Of course we wouldn't. Why? Because we are completely emotionally indifferent. These branches are nothing to me. He says, well, that's how you should then cultivate the same attitude towards your own body, towards your own senses, towards your own life. But he didn't say that's how you should start dismissing your own body and saying, well, it's not really real and whatever else. Because that would just be obscuring the problem. So yes, you want the attitude of completely indifferent, equanimous in regard to your own existence, your own senses, your own thoughts, basically your own feelings. But that cannot be done if you keep denying those thoughts and feelings, or explaining them in some sort of ideological terms, such as like a scientific take. Because often people would say, oh yes, the modern science is proving that the Buddha was right. If the modern science were proving that the Buddha was right, means that every modern scientist who partakes in that view would be at least a Sotapanna, or even more. But the fact that they're not means they don't know what the Dhamma is, so they cannot even accidentally prove it. And furthermore, science is directly divorced from any phenomenological proof of the Buddha's teaching, because science inherently negates the existence of observer, of the subject, of the personal point of view. Science inherently operates under the assumption of a public world independent of all of us, failing to see that that's a point of view that you are completely bound up with and you cannot step outside of it. Which means if you engage in science on account of trying to understand the Buddha's teaching, or if you engage in a scientific view, basically, you're engaging in the view of the denial of the problem of the personality, personal attachment, and craving in regard to your feelings and all of that. Because then you're just explaining what's happening. You're not really uprooting it through understanding, which is already what Sotapanna begins to do. So similar actually to that, I got a book. I wanted to read that bit. It's quite connected to that whole denial. It's when people, like there are those similes in the suttas where people would say, the Ajahn say, well, this body is made out of various organs and parts that, you know, when they break down, there won't be any life left. There won't be any body remaining. Thus, there is nothing for me to take there to be mine. But people, again, it's easy to misread that because the point is subtle. So people would then think, things that are made out of parts are not real. So there's the famous, the questions of the King Milinda when he says, well, it's like having a chariot that is made out of parts. And if you take the chariot apart, you have all these random parts. Thus, chariot doesn't really exist. But that argument fails to see that a chariot is already a particular functional assembly of parts. And if you don't call it chariot, you can call it an assembly of parts. And that's a completely valid reality and valid truth, and it was never the problem. But because the problem is subtle, the problem is not in the things that you own, it's not in the conventions or your designations, the problem is in your attitude towards it, as in attitude of appropriation and assumption. That's what the Buddha said, the five aggregates are not upadana. Five aggregates are not assumption and attachment, but there is no attachment without the five aggregates. But these questions of King Milinda, he actually goes in explaining that, see, five aggregates can actually be broken into parts. There is no real person there. But that is putting the problem of ownership, putting the problem of attachment into the five aggregates, and then destroying the five aggregates, you destroy the problem. But the Buddha himself said the problem is not in it, it's in regard to it. Desire and lust in regard to the five aggregates, the attachment to your experience is there. So that's what I mean, like using that kind of argument just obscures the problem, doesn't solve it. Denial of the reality doesn't solve your attachment to it. Because then you become attached to the reality of that denial. And you just obscure it. When you read in the suttas, when the Buddha would encourage people to investigate, well, not investigate, but really contemplate the various parts of your body, as in a basis for experiencing a non-attraction and revulsion. That's basically to undermine your gratuitous notion of body is beautiful, or to undermine your gratuitous notion of you are in control, like you are the master of this body. So in order to practice that contemplation rightly, you need to do it on the basis of that body that has arisen, on the basis of that ownership of your body. Which means you need to start seeing these parts of the body within that single unit of the functional arrangement that your body is. Because by seeing that there are parts of this functional arrangement of unit of the body that I own, you can see that actually that ownership is gratuitous. It's not that that body is not real. The ownership is gratuitous because this thing that I own, that I think I'm the full master controller, is fully determined by these random things that I can't even access. For example, your beating heart. Like I see even the expression, my beating heart. You kind of assume the ownership because it belongs to this body that you own. Now, you trying to say, oh well, see, this heart is on its own, operates on its own, if it stops, my life is gone. That's all true. But if you use that argument to say that thus there is really no body there, it's just these parts, well, that's just obscuring the issue. Because there is the body there, because otherwise if there is nothing there, how can you even direct your denial at it? It has to be there to some extent. And that extent is the functional arrangement of the body that is actually comprised out of individual independent parts, not me and my sense of self and my sense of mastery and my control. So yes, it's mentioned in the suttas often, this kind of reflection of various bodily parts, but it needs to be done correctly. It needs to be done on the basis of the body, so that then you can remove that which is not necessary in regard to that experience, and that is your own ownership of it. Your gratuitous assumption of mastery of your life, like fundamentally, even like biologically, my own heart. But if it were yours, you would be able to tell it when to beat and how to beat. You wouldn't be completely left out, pushed outside of it. You can't even access the notion of voluntarily controlling your heart. Yet, if that random pumping muscle in your chest stops, your life's gone. That instant. Yet, at the same time, you maintain the full notion of mastery over your life. So looking at the heart is just, if done correctly, will uproot that gratuitous mastery. It will not deny the reality of your life. And that's why Arahant, who is fully uprooted that, an enlightened person who is fully uprooted that, he still operates normally, seemingly, from external point of view. He has intentions, he has choices, he has decisions. All that stays. What he doesn't have is the ownership of the five aggregates. He doesn't have the ownership of the experience as a whole. He doesn't own his body, he doesn't own his intentions. Doesn't mean he's... And the only way to arrive, basically, at that point of not ownership is to first accept it. Hence the accepting of responsibility for your own actions, accepting the validity, basically, of actions, of the results of actions, of the results of practice needs to be the first step. That's the mundane right view. But if you keep denying it as it's not real, you're denying the basis for your practice.
But it's very easy to deny the problem.
Yeah,
There's no self.
That's for me. It's the most natural. It's the most natural reaction, which is bound to the most fundamental attitude that the Buddha is describing. When there is a pleasure, affirm it further. That's how people react. When people experience the unpleasant attitude, deny it. Try to get rid of it, remove it, and that's like craving in regard to pleasant, craving in regard to unpleasant. So in this particular instance, you realize that there is a problem. There is a problem of the gratuitous sense of self that thinks it's a master and owner, yet the experience keeps contradicting it. Because the suffering, the discrepancy of experiencing suffering should be enough for an authentic, transparent person to see that actually you are not in control. And your gratuitous notion of control, it's the reason for your suffering. You are the one responsible for the discrepancy of your existence that then results in suffering, or results in being liable to suffering. It results in possibility to suffer, possibility to be affected by suffering, and that in itself, recognition of that, is what suffering is.
What about seeing yourself directly?
Sorry?
Seeing yourself directly.
Seeing your sense of self directly, well, you can't. Because you'll be seeing it with your sense of self. As in, you'll be appropriating that in that gratuitous sense of mastery over this sense of self. Which means the sense of self, that's what I said, it's a symptom. It's not an issue that you can see and then directly address. It's a symptom caused by... So if you have to start looking at it as such. Because if you blame the symptom for the illness, you're not going to see the illness that underlies it. So you have to recognize that you can't access that sense of self directly because it's done with the notion of self, which means you might think, oh, this is myself, and that means that that gratuitous sense of ownership in regard to that experience is at the background of it. It's always elsewhere from where you look. So you have to stop trying to expect you're going to find it through like looking and spotting where it is. Because you don't need to. You once you recognize it's a symptom, okay, so you stop trying to chase the symptom. You use it as a criteria whether the illness is still present. And that illness is the sense of ownership of things that you do have say in, that you can kind of experience and relate to directly, such as I choose sensuality, I choose ill will, I choose this over this because I'm purely acting out of desire for pleasure. Desire and lust in regard to the five aggregates. That's what the Buddha described. That's why the upadana and the ultimate upadana, the ultimate attachment, is the attachment of the self-view. That's just a tea picking lady. Stop barking. The ultimate upadana is the upadana of the self-view. And so you maintain basically that symptom, as in, because you keep engaging in that which is keeping you sick. You keep maintaining your desire and lust in regard to your experience, and that's something that you knowingly do. So that's the problem with people who kind of are familiar with the Buddhist practice. They're aware of the sense of self, they're aware that it's supposed to be seen as not myself, as in anatta, but they don't see necessarily the connection, so then they just keep trying to deny the sense of self, trying to like, oh, not mine, not mine, not mine, not mine, and address it on its own terms. Failing to see basically that it's their desire and lust, they're fully aware in regard to other things throughout their life. That's the connection that they're missing. And that's why, because of that, the sense restraint and sila and virtue comes first. Because that, you can't possibly not be perpetuating desire and lust in your thought when your physical actions and verbal actions are fully engaged in it. You can think your thoughts are pure as much as you want, but they're not, because your behavior is still perpetuating that mistaken pattern. So you have to start restraining it on that level, so that then it can become clearly visible on the level of your thought. Hey. So that's what I mean. You have to see the connection between these things, as in your gratuitous sense of ownership is maintained through your careless giving into the desire, giving into the ill will, giving into the distraction, giving into the unwholesome states in your daily experience. And that's where the practice is. Being watchful of those things, not being watchful of everything and nothing, or trying to catch your sense of self, or trying to catch a perfect moment that will reveal that nothing is real, thus there is no self really. No, none of that was ever a problem. The only problem is you engaging in unwholesome, and that's why it's defined as unwholesome, because it's a direct determination of the problem of suffering, of the problem of gratuitous ownership and mastery of your experience. That's why it's unwholesome. If it doesn't partake in that, it's not unwholesome, which means it's either neutral or it's either wholesome. Hey, shut it. Shut it. Go and play with Java. He's healthy.
So what happens then when you no longer own that sense of self?
Well, that's the true definition of freedom. You have basically laid down the burden of action, you have laid down the liability to suffer. It just cannot affect you. And that's the direct measure of that freedom. Inability to suffer amidst suffering.
That sounds like a kind of madness, like somebody who denies.
Right. Well, no. See, that's what I mean. That's why I keep saying you have to start with non-denial, because it will result exactly in that. People doing all sorts of horrendous things and then saying, well, there is really nobody there, which was exactly one of the wrong views that the Buddha was criticizing back in the day, when in India they believed, and actually I read that was in Bhagavad Gita, was the whole point of saying nobody, you can go and kill, you can chop people's heads off and nobody gets killed. It's just a sword running through the elements and whatnot. And the Buddha criticized that as extremely wrong view. They can result in a lot of suffering for you if you act out of it. See, that's when you basically jump to a conclusion, not develop the understanding of the conclusion. And if you actually look closer at this conclusion, you realize, okay, in order to understand it, I must stop denying things. I must accept that human life is a real thing. A choice is a real thing. The body, it's a reality as such. Things appear differently, but they are real in whatever manner they appear. So even a pure abstract thought, it is real as an abstract thought. That's a definition of phenomenology. As in basically understanding of phenomena, understanding of appearance. But people get a hint of it maybe, there is really no self. They find that view pleasing without any understanding of it, and that's when they develop these conclusions. So I can do whatever I want because there is no doer there, and there is nobody who receives that doing either. There's nobody affected. And that was exactly the view when in the time of the Buddha and before and obviously after, whereby you can say things such as, no, it's your duty to go and kill these people. You can go and kill them, and nobody gets killed anyway. We are all already divine and saved and whatnot. So that's what I mean. The denial must stop first in order for basis of understanding to arise. Because how can you understand the ownership of something that you appropriate as yours if you keep denying that you appropriated anything? Oh, when are you going to give me back, I don't know, those books I lend you? What books? There are no books. Books don't exist. What are you talking about? No, you took it. And in this case it's even worse because you keep taking it, that which is not yours. You keep regarding it as mine.
So who's the real owner of things?
Well, the question of a real owner is based on already that misperceived owner that you are. As in, okay, so if I'm not the owner, who's the real owner? And that's exactly, again, another view back in India that's very prevalent today, the greater sense of self. You abandon your sense of self by surrendering it to the greater sense of self. But the slightest notion of the sense of self, you can only relate to it because you're maintaining it on your own self level. As in, if you abandon your sense of self, truly, if you see it as thoroughly unownable, so to speak, thoroughly independent of you because it depends upon things that you cannot even access, let alone control and tell him what to do, any extension of that sense of self is seen under the same nature. Not mine, not for me, not myself. So if people can conceive and act out of the greater sense of self, as in God, for example, they do so based on their very personal sense of self. And that's why Sartre meant that basically the most common idea of God is just the extension. It's the ideal of your sense of self, being the ultimate master creator, that then you project into this outer universe of the great God, being of a God or whatever, the mystic energy and so on. All of that is relatable only through your sense of self. And that's another thing. You can either deny your sense of self, try to get rid of it, which fails, or you can try to envelope it in a greater sense of self, which is just extension, proliferation of it, which is even worse, because it's another way of obscuring your own sense of self. Same would be, it was God's will and so on. You decided that what you've done was actually rooted in the greater sense of self, because truly intentions arise on their own, but you are the one who chooses to act upon them. Intentions present themselves. You see a cup, you can use it for drinking, you can use it for throwing, chasing a wild animal. You can use it for all these sorts of things. It's an object that has all this intentionality implied in it, but you choose to use it in a certain manner on account of whatever you're trying to achieve. But then dismissing the reality of the cup or the object you chose to use, you hope to cover up your responsibility for the choice of that thing, and that's something you can't do. Or ascribing the intentionality of an object to a greater God, and then saying, well, see, these things were presented to me in all this manner, that's why I used it, it's not my fault. It's not your fault that things were presented in a manner of options, but it is your fault to choose to act upon it irresponsibly and deny the responsibility or act out of greed, aversion, delusion. That's what I mean. Denial must stop. Because as long as you deny things, you interfere with that which is actually not on you. Arising of the thoughts, arising of the options, arising of the intentions. But you then choosing to act in a certain manner on account of this or on account of that, that's on you. And that's why the Buddha would say all he teaches basically is suffering and freedom from it, in a sense of by avoiding unwholesome, cultivate the wholesome. Because it's not unwholesome to have a thought of throwing this object at somebody. But if you then start relishing that thought and thinking upon it further intentionally, now that bit is unwholesome, and that's on you. Or even worse, if you choose then to verbally start acting upon it in an abusive manner and then physically start abusing somebody, well, that's just the further proliferation of that unwholesome attitude. So that's what I mean, the responsibility must be taken first, the denial of things must be basically abandoned. And then you created the basis for the practice of Dhamma. And that's why it's a middle way. Because you don't go and deny everything or affirm everything. You recognize where the line is, where your responsibility begins and where it ends. And you start thinking like that, you can make sense out of what Arahant is. Because people would often like, what, Arahant is this like thoughtless, basically robot who just acts automatically. No, he's just a person who has basically removed any ownership, any appropriation, any interference of things that arise naturally, which means he's incapable of acting unwholesomely. It doesn't mean that whatever he does or says will be pleasing to people. It means that he cannot be rooted in greed, aversion, delusion. It cannot be rooted in a wrong view. Come here, boy. Come here. Come here, boy. Hey, Jabu. Hey. Focus. Sit. Good boy. Come here. Come here. Come closer. Come closer. Oh. You're a Jabu. But you're a good girl. I don't want him to go down there. That fence needs to be fixed. They might discover. Oh, you lunatic. That's why in practical terms and kind of ultimately, all a person would need to do really is keep an eye on their own intentions, motivations, what makes them act, because that's what determines wholesome and unwholesome, and then how wholesome or how unwholesome it can be. And that's something you cannot not be aware of. Hence mindfulness is something you can't have too much of, as the Buddha would describe. It's not like a rigid mechanical observation of moment to moment to moment. No, it's awareness of that which is already present. Fundamentally, intentions. Because if you're mindful basically of your body being, you're mindful of your situation, that's already intentional. If you're mindful of your feelings, you're mindful of the situation, that's already intentional. Which means you are then mindful. Not necessarily to the full extent. That's what the Buddha said, mindfulness developed to the extent necessary for the final knowledge. But the possibility of you being mindful of it is always there because these things are present. So that means you can actually then discern the background of whatever your situation is, which is already, that background is part of it. You can then discern the subtler motivation behind your actions. And if you discern it, you will see if it's wholesome or unwholesome. Is this rooted in desire, sensuality, greed, aversion? Is this rooted really in ill will, desire to harm or something? Or is genuinely rooted in good, in non-greed, non-aversion? And if once you discern it, you'll be able to then not act out of it. And that's all you need to do. You don't need to try to get rid of the possibilities of unwholesome. They're just part of how things arise. You can use it for good or for bad. The responsibility is on your choice how to use it, not on the possibility of how it can be used. But none of that can become apparent if you're just sort of if you have completely obscured that responsibility of your own choice, that wholesome, that unwholesome. And you obscure it through denying or through projecting it onto someone else's fault. It's the God's will and everything else. say, even if it's God's will to present you with a certain choice, He can't make you choose this A over B. That's why the early existential philosophy said it's not that the phenomenology and phenomenological method it's atheistic or anything like that. It's basically just recognizing the fact that God has no power over your choice. So you can allow the gods to exist as much as you want, but none of the gods can tell you how to choose it. You are the one who chooses what God told you to act upon it. Which means whether things come your way out of complete circumstance, randomness, accident, God's will, previous action, previous karma and vipaka and whatever else, makes no difference, because you presently are responsible for choosing how to act upon it. Oh, this is because of... No. Oh, sorry. I've done this because of that. No, because you done that because you chose this to be the reason for it. Because you can always say no to everything, or yes to everything. Which means you can always do the opposite of whatever's presented to you. Means the choice is always on you. That's why the whole definition in the philosophy was basically man is condemned to be free. But you cannot not choose. Like sometimes people think if I abstain from choice, I didn't choose. But abstaining from choice, it's another choice. You just chose that. And that's why the Buddha said being means exactly this, basically. Beings are bound with their actions. They cannot escape it. As in abstaining from your action becomes an action for you. So the only way to escape the action is to truly first accept it and then see the degree of your responsibility in it and stop maintaining that. Not trying to overly deny action or overly explain it. Sorry, it's less than before. So in practical terms, if people want to meditate and practice correctly, in this manner, always keep a corner of your eye at the back of your mind, basically, where your intentions are. And before you do something, check with yourself why are you doing it? Why do you want to do it?
You always get an answer.
Yeah, it might take a time to cut through all that, like layers of cover-ups, but it's there.
Yeah, you know the truth.
Yeah, you know the truth. Yeah. As we were discussing before, the simile I was telling you, well, the example, it wasn't really the simile, but like say you're somebody who is on a oh, that's a beautiful eagle. You're somebody who is on a like a, not necessarily a strict meditation retreat, but say you're practicing seclusion, practicing non-distraction and so on, and then you have a thought that arises, oh, I want to go to the library in the monastery, and now to get some sutta books so I can read and study harder. Now see, on the external, based on the external point of view, that's a good thing to do. Reading suttas, enriching the basis of your knowledge, contemplation and so on. But that's not the point of view that matters. It's the internal point of view that matters for whoever practices it. So what you should want to do, not like try to justify your impending action based on the external acceptance of it or denial of it. You want to justify it or not based on the internal reasoning. So if you start looking at it, why do I really want to go to the library and take these books right now? Wait for a while, because probably you're not going to get the answer immediately. But you can then see that, oh, actually, I want to go because I hope there'll be some people there and I'll end up being distracted. I'll end up talking to somebody because I feel a bit, well, a pressure of doing nothing, being alone. So going into the group of people can alleviate that pressure. But I can't admit that to myself directly, so I find an excuse of going to a library to take the suttas where I know there is a 90% of chance there will be like-minded people and they're going to start talking to me. But that's the whole point. Then I won't feel responsible for choosing to distract myself because, well, they started talking to me. It would have been rude to just remain silent. But you fail to see that you already decided to talk to them by making yourself liable to that possibility of going in the environment where there's a good likelihood of people distracting you from your own basically self-awareness and solitude and so on. So now you can say, oh, so I'll never go to a library again. Well, that's also impossible. That's also overdoing it. No, go to the library, but for the right reasons. There might be a genuine need to go to a library, but it was the unwholesome part of your mind that made it into the unwholesome, rooted it in unwholesome desire. Because yes, certain things you can abandon straight away. Engagement in sensuality, sexuality, lying, stealing, you abandon that. There is no wholesome way of doing that. But as the Buddha pointed out, there are things such as eating food. You can't stop that because you die. But if you eat it carelessly, if you're not aware of your reasons behind eating the food, if you don't keep those reasons present and clear, if you don't develop clarity in regard to them, inevitably you're gonna eat out of greed and out of sensuality, out of enjoyment for taste, not need for the nutriments. And that's something you have to responsibly maintain each time you eat the food. And that's the whole point of that contemplation. I will eat for the sake of health and sustenance of the body, strength so that I can continue practicing. I will not eat for beautification, I will not eat for sensual enjoyment, I will not eat for taste. But that's not something that's always written, like decided for you. That's something that you choose to decide every time you go to eat food. So in this particular instance, all you need to do is be careless of you eating the food and immediately become sensual. If you're not careless, it doesn't go into sensuality. But people, that's harder to maintain. So it's much easier to then just say, I'll not eat food, or I'll only eat food that I hate, and so on. That doesn't matter. You're still going to eat for unwholesome reasons then. Because the unwholesomeness of eating food for unwholesome reasons, it's not in the food. It's in your carelessness. So in the example of going to the library, no. You can still go to the library if you really need to get the suttas or other books that might help you contemplate further. But then you do it very, very carefully. Go to the hours when you know there won't be people. If there are people, avoid looking at them. If you have to look at them, avoid talking to them, even at the sake of being rude. And that's how you know you will not give rise to the unwholesome. But if you just say, I'll never step outside of my house, I'm going to be locked in this cell for 3 months, I will not talk to anybody ever again, you're just obscuring the problem. You're not going to see where the line of your responsibility is. Why? Because you're denying the whole thing. That's why the Buddha did make actually it's an offense to engage in the practice of silence, not talking to anybody ever again. Because they were like those ascetics and Brahmins, they would just refuse to speak for the rest of their life. They say, well, it's misguided. But most people would just jump on the first excuse. Oh, why do I need to go to the library? Oh, because to get the suttas, and that's a good thing. Okay, fine. While the real reason remains underneath, right there. But they refuse to look at it, because then it will fill you with guilt, anxiety, sense of responsibility, which is already a burden. And that's where the practice is. Undoing that burden. But in order to undo the burden of responsibility, first you need to accept it, not deny it.